Hello, everybody, and thank you for attending today's webinar. Today's webinar is about the 9 things we wish we had known about KPIs. Last time I checked, there were 935 people registered, so it sounds like there's quite a few of you out there that are interested in figuring out what we wish that we had known. I'm David Wilsey, the Chief Operating Officer for the Balanced Scorecard Institute, and today I'm joined by Gail Stout Perry. Gail is the Chief Strategy Officer and Vice President of the Americas at Corporator. So this webinar builds on the series of blogs that Gail has written that you can find on the Corporator website that detail all the things that she wished she had known earlier in her career based on what she knows now thanks to her long time experience. Welcome, Gail.
Thanks, David, and hello, everyone.
Before we get to the KPIs, we thought we'd share with you the 9 things you should know about us. So number 1 is that Gail and I have had the pleasure of knowing and working with each other for about 11 years.
That's right, David. And number 2 is that we co-authored a book along with 2 other authors. The book is called The Institute Way, Simplify Strategic Planning and Management with a Balanced Scorecard, and it's now available in English, Arabic, and Vietnamese.
Number 3 is that we're both passionate about fixing things and have a natural tendency to measure things as to get a quantifiable view of performance gaps.
And number 4 is those that know me know I have an avid reading habit. I gravitate to historical books, particularly those about business and leadership. And I also have an incurable travel bug, which provides me ample opportunity to observe organizations all over the globe. So I guess you could say my hobby is studying the world around me, particularly the organizational aspects.
Number 5 is that I worked in manufacturing for most of the 90s and worked with a number of other industries since. And so I've had the experience of trial and error, mostly error, I think, on a lot of these concepts.
And number 6 is I have lived KPIs from many vantage points over the years, from studying KPIs. My undergraduate degree is in industrial engineering, which is a field based on the concepts of leveraging performance management. I've consulted the clients to help them identify and clarify their KPIs. I've taught courses teaching others how to learn to build and use KPIs. And of course, I've implemented and continue to implement KPIs for my own use to manage business performance.
Number 7 is that I've been with the Balanced Scorecard Institute for over 13 years now and helped build out balancedscorecard.org and KPI.org websites, both among the top sites on the internet for free information on this topic. As most of you know, the Balanced Scorecard Institute specializes in consulting and training solutions related to KPI development, strategy, balanced scorecard, and project management.
And number 8, those of you who know me from Balanced Scorecard Institute probably know that I stepped out of consulting a couple of years ago and took a position with Corporator. Corporator is a global software company that provides a business management platform that is software that allows visibility into performance and enables action and accountability for improving performance. And of course, the foundation for visualizing and improving performance is KPIs.
All right, so then number 9 is that we both agree that 9 of these is probably too many. So let's move on to the topic and we'll get started. Gail, why don't you introduce the audience to what prompted you to write your blog series related to what you wish you had known when you first began your career?
Well, I think this quote by Bill Parcells is a good way to do that. When you don't know what you don't know, it's a lot different than when you do know what you don't know. So by choosing to attend this webinar, you're already way ahead of where David and I were when we started our own performance management journeys. We didn't know what we didn't know. And we learned, sometimes as David said, the hard way, some fundamental principles about KPIs. We learned through mistakes, hard experience, and untangling KPI messes at numerous clients. So welcome, and we hope you benefit from the 9 lessons we will share today.
All right, so lesson number 1 is to make sure you know what KPIs are all about. We'll assume that everyone on the line understands that KPI stands for Key Performance Indicator. But that doesn't mean that it wouldn't be helpful to review what that phrase actually means in terms of practical application. It seems like a lot of people miss the point to a certain extent. So key performance indicators are the critical indicators of progress towards a desirable outcome. A lot of folks that think that if you measure a KPI, Any measure could be considered a KPI, but that's really not true. The letter K stands for key. Not everything you can count is a KPI. Key indicators are those that monitor progress towards an important desired result. They track improvement.
That's right. As a software vendor, we help our clients manage performance, so we've been privy to see lots of metrics. Consequently, we've had numerous people ask us, what set of KPIs should I use for my particular industry or sort of company? We always give the same answer. The key performance indicators that you're looking for is dependent on the questions that your organization is trying to answer. For example, are you trying to find a key metric to assess if your client, or if you are fulfilling your chosen customer value proposition? Or are you looking for a key metric to assess if the throughput or quality of a process has improved? If the answer is all of the above, then how are these things related at your organization? So by definition, a KPI is a measurable value that demonstrates how effectively an organization is achieving key business objectives. KPIs are used to evaluate success at reaching targets. So first, you must ascertain what are you trying to accomplish, whether it be a strategic goal or operational goal. So the K for key means the measures are the select few that really indicate that you're making progress toward the outcomes you desire. And we'll explain more about this in lesson number 2.
So then the P stands for performance, which means we're trying to monitor a performance result, as opposed to just gathering data. So to understand performance, the metric needs to answer a key question, as Gail mentioned. That is, that we're asking about the organizational context, or more typically a strategic context. So if I count how many customers I have in different age groups without any real purpose of the analysis, it's just data. If I know what my target age demographic is, and I'm tracking whether that number goes up or down over time, it's a KPI. So if the K and the P are fairly clear, the I still trips up a few folks. So I stands for indicator, which means that the metric is indicative of whether your performance is moving in the right direction or not. There's no such thing as a perfect metric that provides 100% truth. This is why we use the term indicator. I like to joke that some of the confusion out there that we see revolves around this letter. It seems like some people think that I stands for initiatives. Now, this is a fundamental mistake people make. When initiatives and actions are, they're critical. While they are critical at getting things done, they don't measure impact or accomplishment. I can implement a new marketing initiative and track whether the initiative was on time and on budget, without really learning about whether it was effective. Usually these things go hand in hand as I implement an initiative in order to move the needle on my KPIs. So looking back, I think I wish I had a better grounding when I started on the basic question that KPIs are trying to answer. So lesson 2 is that we need to agree on what we're trying to accomplish first. Okay, so before you start developing and implementing KPIs, you have to articulate what you're trying to accomplish. Sometimes in operations, there's a rush to judgment to just start counting things. In manufacturing, there was always a good faith effort on the part of the quality folks to measure and track everything. Unfortunately, not a lot of thought went into the question of what do we really need to know. Some of the data we were collecting was meaningful, and some of it just turned out to be busy work over time. Then the agreement part of this lesson is important. Even establishing consensus on high-level strategy in a big picture sense can be misleading. I've seen clients establish 100% consensus on a high-level strategy only to have that consensus fall apart when they try to translate that strategy into measurable results. So no matter what level of the organization you're focusing on, or no matter what model you're using, the first thing you have to do is articulate what good looks like. We use the term objective in our model, but in other models you might think of these as goals or use some other term. Objectives tend to capture, in a qualitative sense, what continuous improvement you're trying to accomplish. To get KPIs, that high-level intention is translated into intended results that capture in concrete terms what good looks like. From there, quantitative measurements, or KPIs, are identified and implemented. We've found that the basic model illustrated here can be implemented at any level and for any type of measurement, from the strategic to operations to employees, etc. there are three components. At the operational level, I might have an objective to improve product quality. And an intended result might be that products are produced without defects, and the KPI might be the defect rate itself. And so, we have the three components: objective, intended result, and KPI. Now, while this seems like it's an obvious example, you might be surprised at how often we all seem to agree on the objective and the abstract, but then have complete disagreement as to what the intended result actually looks like. And without an agreement on the intended result, the KPI is really a mystery as well. So then lesson number 3 is that KPIs require comparative context to be meaningful. As we mentioned earlier, you must have context to determine if the metric is key or not, and to understand performance. And to understand performance, you have to have more than one individual data point. So let me give you an example. So Gail, tell us something about yourself.
119, 101, 54.
119, 101, 54. So how many of you instantly realized that Gail was describing a color using the RGB color model? And of those that figured it out, how many of you interpreted her answer to mean hazel? And out of those that figured that out, how many just deduced she meant her eye color? So as you can tell, without any context, numbers don't have any meaning.
Right. So it's all about the context. So, lesson 1, we talked about what does KPI stand for, the K, the P, and the I. Lesson 2, we talk about aligning the outcomes. And lesson 3, we're talking about for a single KPI to have meaning, you need comparative context. There's lots of ways to provide comparative context for a KPI. The simplest way is to compare the measure to a target, which is a desired level of performance. This is typically visualized using color thresholds to compare performance with levels around your target that you've predetermined to be good, moderate, or bad. That's the red, yellow, green. But you can also benchmark performance by comparing to others. Benchmarking was actually one of the foundational reasons Corporator was established, and is actually part of our name, Corporate plus Rater. Because in the real world, we found that people don't get real excited about performance against a target or a threshold all the time, or they argue that their piece of the organization is different from everybody else. But when you set up benchmarks, people or units can see how they stack up against others, either inside or outside the organization. And with this clarity of comparative performance, people get more motivated in terms of performance improvement. David, one of those lessons learned blogs that you mentioned that I wrote focused on the people side of things, what I wish I'd known about the people side of things. I've learned that even when dealing with something seemingly as emotionless as KPIs, the people side just keeps slipping right in there. You can never forget the human component. So at the end of the day, we aren't measuring just for the sake of measuring the KPI. We are measuring for the purpose of driving performance improvement, and that's why comparatives are powerful to help us even understand our current level of performance.
Another key tip related to the comparative element is the use of ratios. The denominator provides a way to judge, if you will, whether the number is good or bad. If I trend turnover literally using a simple count like this, it might look like we're in trouble. But if I told you that we acquired another company last year, and our overall number of employees has increased dramatically, you might realize that this simple turnover number was actually misleading. Better would be to trend the turnover ratio, as this total population number is required to give the turnover numbers the proper context. Some of the examples of ratios are listed on the slide, and many of these you're probably very familiar with, like percent completion, defect rates, or per capita type ratios. The point is that the population number is needed to provide context for the actual count number. So lesson 4 is that frameworks will outline your story of performance. The point of this lesson is that basic comparison context is not enough. For people to really engage emotionally with your KPIs, you'll want to tell a story with your KPIs. The bad news is that not everybody is a natural storyteller. The good news is that you don't have to be. There are tons of frameworks out there designed to help you tell a story about how your KPIs connect. Some frameworks are focused on high-level strategy, and others connect the dots on a very specific operational issue.
So A framework or a system of performance allows you to answer questions such as, why did we get these results? Or is it likely that our performance will improve? And you do this by organizing the information into a business context of if-then or cause and effect using a framework. By understanding the drivers of performance, you can understand and communicate to others the leverage you can pull, the influence you can have through actions or focus or investments to impact future desired performance results.
So obviously a framework that is near and dear to our heart here at the Balanced Scorecard Institute is the Balanced Scorecard itself. So like other frameworks, the Balanced Scorecard is helpful for contextualizing KPIs and articulating a cause and effect story related to your strategy. So the picture here shows a communication element of the Balanced Scorecard, which is the strategy map. So this is the Corporator strategy map, and Corporator uses it to visualize their strategy and provide context for their KPIs. It tells a story about the objectives they're trying to achieve, and it connects the dots from either from top down or from bottom up. You can read the story either way. So if I were to look at the bottom, I can see that from an organizational capacity standpoint, we're interested in ensuring a values-driven culture and a safe working environment, and we're finding the right talent. Those objectives are driving the objectives in the internal process perspective around account management and delivery and process quality and improving margins and supply chain processes, etc. So those then drive the results perspectives of customer and stakeholder and financial. The point is that this story provides context. It helps me understand how my strategy works. And if I'm an employee, I will help. It helps me understand why we're tracking, say, the right talent. Why do we have measurements around skills? The skills that we're measuring are critical for this particular strategy. Maybe I need supply chain skills. Maybe I need process improvement skills, etc. The point is that the context is provided by this picture. So most of the frameworks that we'll talk about today, it will help you tell this story around a particular focus area. This one is around strategy, but the other tools focus on more specific ones. But they provide context for the KPIs.
There are, as David mentioned, there are many other models, such as logic model, process flows, value driver trees, and we'll get into even more models later in this webinar. But the important value provided by these sorts of models and frameworks is that they provide the context by connecting individual KPIs into a system of performance. And it is through these frameworks that we understand the full story of performance, how KPIs are organized and how the cause and effect story works. So let's take another quick example. Let's take 3 standalone KPIs. First one is cancer rates. Second one is the percent of population that smokes. And the third one is the number of smoking cessation programs held. Now, first we need overall organizational context. Who are we? So for this example, let's say we're a healthcare organization that provides smoking cessation programs. Knowing this, I can start to realize that these KPIs can be organized into a cause and effect using the logic model framework. Because the smoking cessation programs are just a key program that our organization provides. There are inputs and outputs of this program, which are also potentials for KPIs. And ultimately, these programs lead to individuals quitting smoking, which is an outcome, which leads to a reduction in the percent of population that smokes, which leads to lower cancer rates, which is a longer-term outcome. So now I start to see the cause and effect relationships across multiple KPIs.
We're all used to telling cause and effect stories with measures. If I eat fewer cookies, I will lose weight, in theory. If I exercise regularly, my blood pressure will improve. If I sell more widgets, I will make more money. If I reduce product defects, I'll increase sales. Sometimes it's only a hypothesis, but the story helps me understand the theory so that I can use the measures to test it. At this most basic level, we're talking about the concepts of leading and lagging. So leading indicators are those that are predictive of future performance, and lagging indicators are those that capture the results we're ultimately trying to achieve. So the example that Gail just shared tells this type of story. The number of smoking cessation programs held is a leading indicator for the percentage of people that smoke. The percentage of population that smokes is a lagging indicator relative to those programs. But it's also a leading indicator for cancer rates. So whether a KPI is leading or lagging at any given moment depends on this context. It depends on the question you're trying to answer. If you're trying to manage programs that influence smoking rates, or if you're trying to monitor the smoking rates in order to reduce cancer rates. So to recap, a data point without context only tells you one thing. How did we do on this one thing? And then the context helps us understand what the data point actually means relative to other KPI data points in our framework of performance. And this cause and effect storytelling helps us understand how the performance levels of driving factors could potentially help achieve a desired outcome. It helps us understand if our actions are making a difference.
Okay, so let's stop and take a quick poll. The question is, where are you on the learning curve of context and framework? So it's a radio button, please select one. This is the first time I've heard of most of this. I know about, but have not used context and frameworks yet. Or, yeah, we use context and frameworks for our KPIs. We'll just wait a few. Wow, the results are rolling in. Okay. Quickly jumped out into the lead is I know about but have not used context and frameworks. But it looks like it's starting to level out at about a quarter of the people on the call use context and frameworks.
That's right. We have 26% who use them, 55% know about them but have not used, and 18% say this is the first I've heard about this. We're up to about 71% of you all have voted. We'll give you another 5 or 6 seconds.
Yeah, the percentage is starting to rise a little bit of the people who voted. There you go. All right, for those of you who are indecisive, decision time, and know your mouse is hovering.
All right, so it does look like we've ended up. I'll show you the results. We ended up with 18%. This is the first they've heard of this, and 56% know about but have not used context, and 26% use context and frameworks for our KPIs.
All right, so those of you who answered 2 and 3 here, you know about it or have used it, congratulations. This is a fundamental concept to KPIs. So you're further along than David and I were as we began our journey ages ago. So this is good. All right.
All right, so lesson 5 is about putting it all together to tell the full story. For people who really engaged emotionally with your KPIs, you'll want to tell a story, as we've already outlined. Storytelling helps people understand, remember, and engage with the higher level goals you're trying to achieve. Stories help connect the dots between metrics or between the actions and our goals. Almost every story ever written is about someone trying to overcome a challenge to accomplish something. They want to get the girl or beat an opponent or win a game or something. Good leaders also tell stories. We want to sell more products or make the world a better place. We have challenges to overcome and that are holding us back. Leaders and managers use measures to quantify what we're aiming for and what challenges we need to overcome. Stories help us explain how the strategy will work, how taking action will lead to improvement. Thus far, we've shared 2 lessons that help hone the story. Lesson 3 was about comparatives to help help communicate performance on a KPI, such as with ratios or targets or thresholds or benchmarking. And lesson 4 was about frameworks to articulate the cause-effect story across a system of KPIs so that people can see how it all fits together. Now let's take it one step further.
Okay, so remember what we said about the people side of things? KPIs alone do not give you the full picture performance, nor will they necessarily enable you to improve on that performance. And this is the essence of lesson number 5, which is put your KPIs to work for you. Okay, so the full story contains, as David said, the comparatives for a single KPI and the cause and effect context across KPIs that we mentioned in the last 2 lessons. But the full story also includes the human interpretations of performance, as well as the actions and initiatives and risk mitigation activities that you have to put in place to move the needle on the KPIs. And this is where the story comes to life. So let me show you an example. Going back to the strategy map that David showed you earlier, and I wanted to clarify one thing. This is not Corporator's company strategy map, although we do have one. This is a map built in Corporator. But going back to that example, we see that improving the supply chain processes is a key driver or a leading indicator for the market share objective. So using the framework from lesson 4, we now have context for the KPIs we're about to see when we drill into this objective. Okay, so go into this objective. Up here on the left side of the page, you see we have 3 KPIs, the key performance indicators for this objective. And we already explained how we need to choose these back in lesson 2. And as we look at how the KPIs are visualized, we start to see the context that we mentioned in lesson number 3. We see comparatives and trend lines. We see more comparatives in actual to target and deviations for the KPIs. We see status gauges, which indicate performance in relation to the thresholds, the red, yellow, green color bands. And we even see benchmarking of various regions using the same KPI in order to have a comparative of performance across business units. In addition to all of this quantitative metadata giving us a comparative story in context of the overall strategy, KPIs are augmented by qualitative information. In other words, words help you understand the full story. For example, comments that live along with the data points can help you remember or explain past performance as compared to current performance. In this particular example, we see learnings and insights from key team members responsible for the performance on these KPIs on this objective. So as you navigate back and forth through time, you no longer have to remember or dig through reports and emails to understand why you got the results you did or what actions were implemented to close the performance gaps. The qualitative information lives alongside the quantitative information to tell a more complete story. And as we mentioned, the whole point is to tell the full story. And as David said, a full story has characters, in other words, the people side. And of course, you need action to move the plot along. Actions lead to outcomes on the KPIs. So what we see here is an example of strategic initiatives and projects that align to move the KPI needles on our supply chain objective. To go all the way back to lesson 1, here is where the initiatives lie. Initiatives, as David mentioned, are not KPIs. They're the initiatives, and what's happening around the initiatives are indicators related to the action of implementing an initiative. So success on an initiative will move the needle on our true KPIs, the outcomes we're trying to achieve. And of course, at every step, a narrative from the human characters in the form of comments and qualitative information fully fleshes out the story of performance. Okay, so we've covered a bit of ground quickly here. So let's stop and take another poll. Get your mice ready. Mouses, how do you say that, David? All right, so the question is, how well do your KPIs tell stories? And in this case, you can check all that apply. Your options are, we link KPIs to gain early insights into future performance. In other words, you have a system of drivers and results. We use some sort of visual analytics to interpret performance data. We use benchmarking to see comparative performance. We use qualitative information, the words with our KPIs, or none of the above. Okay, it looks about a quarter of you have voted, about a third of you have voted. Okay, starting to roll in now. All right. You have 2 kind of jumped out neck and neck right away. It's interesting.
It looks like quite a few of you use visual analytics to interpret performance data.
Mm-hmm. Over half of you, actually.
Yeah.
Interesting.
The qualitative information is also commonly used.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, remember you can check all that apply. All right, we're over 70%, so we'll give you another 5 or 6 seconds, and then we'll move on. All right, so let's close and look at the results. So 41% of you said that we link KPIs to gain early insights. 53% use visual analytics. 41% use benchmarking, and 45% use qualitative information with our KPIs. And then 12% of you are new at this.
Very good.
All right, very good.
All right, we're in the home stretch now.
That's right. So lesson 6 is about carefully mashing up methods and frameworks. We've introduced only a couple of frameworks thus far, because there's many of these. This lesson here is about blending frameworks. Over the years, we've seen many clients end up trying different strategic methods and techniques, and over time they can end up with a mishmash of objectives, goals, measures, results, priorities, strategies, indicators, and other things. A mashup like this can destroy the focus and power of a simple system in which things are connected in a logical way. We once worked with a client that said that it felt like we cleaned out their garage, their attic, and their basement as we untangled a jumbled mess of performance management components that they had accumulated over the years. We helped them find the elements to keep. We helped them find elements to get rid of, and to find ways to connect key elements together using a logical framework to manage all these strategic corporate performance components.
So what we're saying is, if you're using a logical framework consistently, you're already far ahead of most. And just make sure you keep it as simple as possible. If you start blending frameworks, especially in a single domain, such as strategy frameworks, and in a single domain, such as strategy, beware of your lexicon. If I use the word goal in a way that is synonymous with how David uses the word target, then we already have communication confusion and how we're communicating in context of strategy. But we're also saying it is common and often helpful to leverage multiple frameworks at the same time, because different frameworks serve different purposes. So here's an example of common frameworks across strategic and operational domains. And we typically see blends of frameworks within and across domains. So for example, if you look at the top under the strategy domain, we've seen organizations combine balanced scorecards with OKRs. Why? Well, because they're using balanced scorecard for longer range strategy and strategic planning and execution, and they want to use OKRs for a more rapid cadence of both strategic and operational execution at the individual and team levels. So they've blended two frameworks in the strategy domain, and that's where you have to be careful with your lexicon. And of course, once you start linking operations to strategy, you naturally must mix frameworks. For example, there are TPM or portfolio and project management frameworks used to manage a multitude of things, from strategic initiatives to continuous improvement or business transformation efforts. There are GRC models, governance, risk, and compliance. And governance models can range from simple policy compliance to complex legal compliance, such as the SMCR, the Senior Managers and Certification Regime found in the banking industry in the UK. So risk management models range from COSO to all sorts of customized varieties we've seen to manage strategic risk, financial risk, operational risk, product risk, and more. But the one thing that all of these models have in common is, drumroll please, they utilize KPIs to interpret and to manage performance. So if you're wondering what some of these frameworks look like, here's a simple example of a risk framework. You will find that a KRI, in this framework, it stands for Key Risk Indicator, may also function as a KPI in your strategy framework. And it also may be a key metric in one of your operational or quality frameworks. The point is, there's no reason to duplicate effort of data collection or operate frameworks in silos. You're simply viewing the KPI through a different model in order to understand a different dimension of performance. So how can the same KPI answer different questions? It's all about the context.
So if you start blending frameworks, it is key to be disciplined and deliberate in how you go about implementing KPIs across the frameworks. The key takeaway here is that don't look at business and operational domains in isolation from each other or in isolation from the strategy domain. Performance, and therefore KPIs, are all interconnected.
Okay, so we're going to stop and take another poll. And the question on the table this time is, have you blended frameworks? Okay, and your options are, and you can only select one this time, not that I know of. Yeah, we've blended a few, and it works pretty well. Or, yes, we blended a few, but whoo, we have a mess on our hands. And number 4, I have a headache, Gail. And I know some of you have blended because I saw some questions come in earlier about mixing KRIs and KPIs in the same system. I saw that early in the webinar. So let's see here. About 60% of you have voted. Only get one radio button. Make your choices.
Few people with a headache.
He's my headache. About 10% of you need some aspirin. Oh, there comes another one. Tequila.
All right, so we're almost up to 70% voted. So we'll give you another maybe 10 seconds.
Okay.
Yeah,
we're slowing down, David. Okay.
All right, so here's the results. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, David.
We have 41% that don't know, not that I know of, or 29% that say, yes, we've blended a few and it works well. 19%, yes, we've blended a few, but have a mess. And then 11% have a headache. So it sounds like this is a bit difficult for a few of you.
All right. So for those of you who have a headache, just hang in there. There's only one more really hard lesson left. It's lesson number 7. The devil is in the details. So we're getting close to Halloween here in the U.S. So what we've been discussing thus far is how to select KPIs, how to connect them in a system of drivers and results, and how to tell a full performance story around your KPIs. And once we do the hard work of figuring out what our KPIs should be, many would like to just declare victory and leave it to others to implement. But from my seat ringside here on the implementation side, I can tell you the devil is in the details. To fully implement a KPI, we need to organize how it aggregates or rolls up to higher levels. We have to decide at what level to collect the data. And the closer to the action we are when we collect the data, the more insights we can obtain. Typically, when we analyze performance, we start with an aggregate view, and then we just drill down as performance questions arise, or when we want to compare, one unit to another. So for this lesson, we're going to use a very simple example that I believe most of you can relate to. What we're showing here is an organization. It's very simple, organized hierarchically. There are 2 regions, Texas and California, and lucky for us, they mirror each other nicely. We have 3 units in each location, the sales team, repair team, and the executive team. And each location, sales and services, 2 product lines. So let's pretend I'm the head of operations at the corporate level, and I'm looking at a KPI called travel expenses. Most of you have likely seen this sort of information on a P&L report. And typically, you only drill down in the details and wondering why a cost category is higher or lower than usual, or when you observe a variance from a target or threshold. Remember, go back to lesson number 3. But if we only capture total company travel expenses at the corporate level as a single data point, because that's our KPI, I would have no ability to drill in and look for the root cause of or explanation for an excessive amount of travel expenditures last month. I see the status is yellow, but why? I'd be sending someone off to dig into it for me. So the first takeaway of this lesson is that the lower in the roll-up structure, you can collect actual data and provide access for drill downs. The more insights individuals can glean into the underlying performance. So the data icons at the bottom of this slide show where it would be best to collect the data for this particular KPI. And when we do this, you can see how now we have the ability to drill down. And this helps me to pinpoint problems such as an executive team over in Texas and the sales team in California have been busting their travel budget. And I can start to dig into that a little bit more. And I can do comparatives as well. Looks like product line 2 is doing okay. Something's going on with product line 1 as both locations are traveling to perform more repairs than we anticipated. Guess what? the valuable comparative information that we talked about way back in lesson 3 is, in this case, the ability to benchmark one product line against another. It's only made possible by the way we decided to collect and aggregate that KPI. So as I said, the devil's in the details. But what's so complicated about all this, right? Roll up, drill down. In theory, it's very straightforward. Except very few organizations are designed in a perfectly logical and hierarchical way. And to complicate matters, there are always exceptions and changes. Look what happens when California decides to reorganize. Thanks, California. Now they've combined the sales and repair function into a single department. Without proper foresight and planning, I suddenly have lost my ability to compare performance of the sales and repairs functions across the 2 locations. And come on, guys, who actually works in a perfectly hierarchical organization where every geographic location, division, and function mirrors the others, like in the simple example? So let's take our current example one tiny step further and reorganize it into a matrix organization. In this 2-dimensional view of the very same organization, we can still collect our data with the same granularity. And this allows for the aggregation of the roll-ups to the geographic region and by department. So we still have the same comparative abilities we had before, but wait a minute, what happened to the product lines? We actually need a cube to finish out this model. And this has been a very simple example of what we deal with in real life implementations. So the takeaway in this lesson is you actually have to think through the logic of how you organize a single KPI. Where will you collect the data? How will you aggregate it? How do you want to navigate through drill downs? And it all comes back, once again, to the fundamental thing we've been talking about repeatedly in the webinar. What is the question you're trying to answer? KPI design really depends on the insights you're trying to gain in order to identify issues, understand performance, and inform decision making. It takes some practice, but it's solvable, especially with a good software system. And this is why we included software implementation as part of the 9 steps to success in implementing a balanced scorecard. Because bringing your KPIs to life requires the proper tooling. Okay, so we have one last poll. We're curious about what your KPI design experience is. You can select one answer. Never done it? In a rudimentary sense, and that we do track some KPIs. 3 is we have some pretty detailed drill down and aggregate measures we work with. And 4 is we have dealt with complex KPI design.
All right, very quickly, up to over 50% of you have voted. It looks like the in a rudimentary sense is the winning option so far. All right, we're up to 70%. I'll give you another 5 to 10 seconds or so. It seems like we sort of max out at about 75%, so the rest of you must be checking email. All right, so here's the results. We have 12% who have never gone down this path. 48% in a rudimentary sense, we have tracked some. 34% we have some pretty detailed drill down, and 6% we have dealt with complex KPI design. All right, good. So there's a wide variety of experience on the line today. All right, so the good news for those of you that are still wrestling with this is that lesson 8 is that it doesn't have to be perfect. Many people take our KPI professional certification course. They go home and then they call a few weeks later in despair. It looks so easy in class, and now they've gone home and they're discovering that it's not actually that easy. It's challenging to create a culture that wants to use KPIs to manage performance. It's a challenge to get people to collect and report data consistently. It's even a challenge to simply define a measure in a way that's consistent and meaningful. So it's all very hard work. On the software side, Gail and I sometimes we'll discuss how clients hope that software will automagically do this foundational work for them. In fact, a software implementation may actually highlight the flaws and the gaps and all those illogical elements of your data and your measures or your framework. It can help force some of the hard work needed for consistency, but it doesn't do the work for you. So the lesson here is don't get discouraged. Many organizations struggle with KPIs, and what I've found is that making progress in one area, maybe a single process or a key strategy or maybe even a single objective, just making progress in that one area can make a tremendous improvement for your organization. So if things do get bogged down for you, I always recommend focusing on one pilot case that can be used to prove that this hard work makes a difference. I've seen skeptical executive team members be won over when they see a single KPI example used correctly. So if the status of your framework or your measurements are starting to get you down, just don't get frustrated. Simplify, focus your efforts on imposing discipline in a key area, and you'll see, I think that you'll find that'll make a difference. Similarly, in lesson number 9, we're talking about that KPIs will help you drive performance outcomes. Keep the faith. It's been shown that simply having a strategy will help an organization outperform its peers. Likewise, research indicates that organizations that use a system of measures will outperform those that don't. I think this is intuitive for most people, as indicated by the way we use measurements in all walks of life. We use them in sports and in business and everything else, medicine. Measurement is needed to drive improvement. Simply having KPIs adds a layer of discipline to key processes and adds linkages from drivers to outcomes, while providing essential information to leaders to make more informed decisions. So Gail, when we started this webinar, I asked you what prompted you to write your blog series related to what you wish you had known when you first started your career. Do you want to finish this up on that thought?
Yes, thanks, David. A key lesson that I wish I had known early in my career is something that a surprising number of business people do not intuitively grasp. And here it is. If you are responsible for something, for a team, a department, a function, then your first order of business is to understand the key processes, the key outcomes, and the key drivers for the area for which you are responsible and how these things link into the broader goals of the organization. How do they fit together? And then figure out what framework or model is appropriate to define outcomes and model the drivers of those outcomes. And once you do that, then you can begin to identify your KPIs and start collecting data to give you the performance insights you need to make decisions and investments to drive future performance results and ensure your unit contributes meaningfully to the organization. But you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can build off the work of others, as long as you are aware of what others have already figured out. So as we've shown in this webinar, that the topic of KPIs can be extensive, but we hope these 9 lessons help our listeners better know what it is that you don't know and leap ahead in your own performance management journeys.
All right, so if you'd like to know more about KPIs, I'd encourage you to visit our KPI informational website, which is kpi.org. You might also look at our Key Performance Indicator Professional Certification Program.
Yeah, and Corporator has provided a couple of links here as well. There's a link to a white paper about storytelling with KPIs, and a link that takes you to examples of a variety of frameworks, like we discussed in an earlier lesson. So we encourage you to explore our website for more webinars, videos, and papers on the topics we've been discussing today.
All right, so that will do it for us today. I think we do have a couple of minutes for some questions. If you do have a question, please find the questions panel on the GoToWebinar interface and post them there. Now, usually when we do that, when we do this, there's a flood of 900 questions that come in right away. So if we don't get to your questions, please contact us directly through the websites on the screen or through the email that you'll get from us. And Gail and I will be happy to get back to you. We always have a lot of questions about the slides and the replay. We will process and upload the replay as soon as we can. Usually that happens in a day or so, and then we send a note out letting you know. All right, Gail,
It's a good question.
Go ahead.
Yeah, there's one that just jumped in about, is a question about qualitative versus quantitative information. Quantitative is, tying it back to the number itself. So you have a KPI, you're counting something. You have a target, that's a number. There's math involved, if you will. You can do math and functions. Same thing with the thresholds, there's the red, yellow, green. That is just interpretations of the data using numbers. That's how I think of quantitative, numbers. Qualitative is words. It's the stuff surrounding it. So qualitative would be the comments that people add, their interpretations, their analysis, as well as the other pieces, such as if you're linking actions and action items or initiatives to move the performance.
That question might have been prompted. I think early on I said qualitative when I meant quantitative. Yes, so you want to use both of them together. Quantitative is telling you, whether your measurements are telling you what you want to know, but the qualitative information is really useful in terms of providing the context, as Gail said. So we have another question about how many KPIs can one have per objective. The question I think you mean is, should you have? Because you can. Unfortunately, we see some clients with hundreds and hundreds of KPIs. You usually want to keep it as simple as possible. So there's not a set number. We aim for maybe between 1 and 3 per objective. There's not a set number because some objectives are more abstract than others, and so you might need more measurements for some of the more abstract ones. If you're talking about revenue, you're probably something very concrete. You probably don't need dozens of measures. So there's not a set answer, but we aim for 1 to 3 per objective.
Oh, it's an interesting one about how to convince management to use KPIs. It's interesting. There's if you email us, we can send you a link to a case study we did with Johnson & Johnson, and how early on management developed an appetite. And so really the crux of it is they have to have an appetite, but you can whet that appetite by giving them, as David mentioned, something simple in the beginning. Just measure a few things, measure a few key processes, and then they'll start to see the value of it, and they'll start to want to drill down and ask more questions and more questions and more questions. So just showing them something sometimes can whet that appetite.
All right, Louise asked the question about does 1 point of time comparison really show what performance is doing? Is this a statistically sound comparison? First of all, hello, Louise. How are you doing? This is a great question. Yes, your point is that you can't really use one data point. You do want to look at a pattern. Always looking for patterns in your data rather than looking for single data point. We don't feel like you've really hit your target if you have one outlier, 1 point that manages to go over your target. You want to trend your performance over time. I know Louise is very familiar with XMR charts and those kinds of techniques that people use to really understand what the data is telling you about.
Exactly. So that was back to lesson 3, in the comparatives. One of the things is a trend line. So whether it's a trend line or it's an XMR chart, but some sort of visual way of looking at performance as compared to something else, but compared over time, compared to past periods, etc. This question on leading and lagging again. I'm glad someone brought that up. I was telling David the other day, early on, I was so confused as to how people would point to a measure and go, "That's a leading measure." I'm like, well, how did you know just by looking at it? And so just to kind of reiterate the slide David shared, it's all contextual. What's a leading indicator in one context is a lagging indicator in another context. So the example he used is, if I'm looking at the percent of people who smoke, that indicator could be leading or lagging depending on the question I'm trying to answer. If I'm looking at the programs that I'm offering, then the percent of population smoke is a lagging indicator as compared to what I'm measuring around those programs. But if I'm looking at cancer rates, the percent of population that smoke is the leading indicator of future cancer rates. And I hope that kind of clarified a little bit.
We have another question about the emotions and fear and anxiety that goes with KPIs, unfortunately. And I can't agree more with the questioner. One of the challenges here is to make sure you're trying to create a culture that that looks at KPIs as information. It's valuable. We want to know when we're not doing very well. We don't want to punish people punish the messenger if somebody finds that we're underperforming in a particular area, because that the information that's telling us that we're underperforming in a particular area is telling us that we need to change something. We need to, move resources around. We need to, focus our process improvement in a particular area. So we want to know that information. And so much of the effort around KPI is around creating the culture that that welcomes this, that thinks that this is valuable.
Oh, I love this question. What are your views around using KPIs, KGIs, and KRIs together to improve outcomes? I'm all for it. So hopefully in the slide that showed the different models that you can have across operational and strategic domains, the point is it's all connected. Right. So if you're measuring KRIs, if you have a risk model, that risk model should be tied into the rest of operations. It should be tied into strategy. I mean, they all fit together. Where is strategy executed? It's not in the office of strategy management. It's on the front lines. It's on people who are doing the operational work on a daily basis. So blending, operations to drive strategic performance is, I think, it's critical.
Yeah, and mixing different methodologies really comes down to making sure that you understand the principles that make the different models work, because you don't want you don't want to use mixed models and end up violating one of those principles to the point where model A doesn't work anymore because you've changed all the terminology to match model B. All right, looks like we have maybe one or two more questions, and then we'll have to move on, I think.
Okay.
A lot of questions about the links that we showed on the last slide. We'll make sure that the person who sends the replay recording out, that they'll put the links in there to the white papers that Gail mentioned. What is the role of quality in the strategic and operational KPIs? Usually, quality is something you focus on in operations. Focusing on producing widgets at a particular level of quality. Almost always, that's driving our strategy as well. I mean, I can't imagine very many organizations that their strategy does not depend on a certain quality levels of quality either to maintain them for a product line that we've had for a long time, or if I want to move in a new direction and I need to get better at quality, or I need to implement quality standards in a new direction for strategic reasons. They're usually all interconnected.
There are so many questions rolling in, David. I'm having trouble focusing my eyes.
It is overwhelming.
Here's one. Okay, are KPIs and balanced scorecard complementary to each other? Well, KPIs are an element of the balanced scorecard. So the balanced scorecard is a framework for defining and articulating and executing your strategy. And one component of that is metrics and honing in on the key metrics for strategy execution. I don't know, David, if you want to add on to that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it is a key component of balanced scorecard.
How is measuring operational KPIs different from strategic KPIs? Well, KPIs are KPIs. It kind of comes back to these fundamental principles we're showing you here. So strategic KPIs live in the context of a strategy framework, and operational KPIs live in the context of an operational framework. It's really as simple as that. David, do you want to augment?
Oh, I'm sorry. I was reading the next question.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I think we have time for maybe one more, and then again, if there's anything that you want us to add, to speak to specifically, just contact us directly. We've had a couple of questions here about cascading and creating alignment. And what we always recommend is that you focus those efforts on the strategy side. What is the intention? And so even if you're mixing models, if you're doing balanced scorecard on the corporate level and OKRs on the individual level, the point is to make sure that the intention, that what are you trying to accomplish, is the focus. So I'm not just cascading a measurement if I'm counting something at the organization level, I'm not going to necessarily cascade that measurement down to my OKR levels. I'm going to make sure I understand what the intention is. What is the goal or the objective or the strategy at the organization level, and make sure that strategic intent gets cascaded down to the department level or then the organization level. Gail, did you want to add to anything there?
No.
All right, it's
loving
3:00.
All these questions.
Yes,
no, it is already.
That's
wow,
what I said.
Okay.
There's always 900 questions that float, and they stream through like a like a waterfall. All right, so I think that's all we have time for today. But Gail, thank you very much for joining me.
Oh, David, thank you so much. I enjoyed collaborating with you again.
Yeah, so it was great, and thank you all, everyone on the line, for joining us, and we will talk to you next time.